Walk with me through the cellar door.
A storm is coming, Francis.
A portal to a more skeptical world.
Cellar Door Skeptics begins right now. Prepare for the revolution with your hosts, Christopher Tanner and Chris Hanna.
Welcome, welcome, welcome. Tonight, we have a unique show. Again, I have one author joining me tonight for the show. Unfortunately, Hanna is caught up with baby stuff right now, so he is going to be unavailable for this specific episode. But I had a great conversation about evolutionary psychology, and as everybody knows on the show, that's one of my favorite topics, especially on the science agenda to talk about, is evolution. So tonight I get to interview an amazing, there you go, I said it, an amazing author and doctor of psychology. So without any further ado, please welcome my guest, Dr. Hector Garcia, author of Alpha God, The Psychology of Religious Violence and Oppression. Welcome to the show. So, first question of the night I have for you is, what inspired you or drove the desire to actually write Alpha God?
So I would say that it was a confluence of factors. 9/11, just spending a lifetime, observing religion, especially in the area where I grew up. I grew up on the border in El Paso, Texas, on the U.S.-New Mexico border. And there's a long history of religious conquest there. The legacy of the conquistadors who came in and did what they did, and the native people who were living there, that they did it to. And, my own ethnicity, my own heritage comes from that history of conquest. And there's signs of it all over the place. And so I started reading the history of the region and just learning about how the Abrahamic faiths really were faiths of conquest. And I've already been interested in evolution, so all the connections just kind of kept getting reinforced in my mind. I thought, well, I gotta write a book about this. So there's a bunch of things.
And that's awesome. So I'll just finished your book last weekend. We had snow up here in Michigan, so gave me a good excuse to pound out the last 50 pages. And, I'll be honest, I think one of the big things about your book is sex, obviously. You talk a lot about sex. Now that's probably because how else can you procreate? You look back at our evolutionary upbringing, right? How else are we going to survive as a species, period? So sex is a big thing on there. What I did find interesting, and I wonder how much crap you got from the Christian community, is about not just about how we as males project ourselves as God, right? And how that came about, but the violent side of it, right? I mean, how much pushback have you gotten about the violent side that people are like, well, my God's not violent. Have you read anything Jesus wrote? I'm not a violent male. I mean, look, I've never beat my wife, but people don't realize a lot of these things are ingrown into us. So you're kind of going to get it from both sides. You're going to get that male aspect where they're going to claim, no, we're not violent people. And then you get the religious side saying, well, my God's not violent. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Well, I will say I didn't get really a lot of that, maybe surprisingly. So one of the things I like to point out when I talk about this book or just anything involving evolutionary science in general is to point out some errors in thinking that we have to be aware of when studying this science. And one of them is called the naturalistic fallacy. And that is an error such in thinking such that, if we acknowledge that something may be arrived at through genetic means or biological means, does that mean that is moral? Does that mean it's desired? Does that mean it's inevitable? And oftentimes it's none of those things. So it's important to be aware of that bias, because that understanding, reading about evolutionary science tends to make some people uncomfortable. And being aware, what it means and what it doesn't mean. There's all kinds of ways that we ignore certain impulses that we have, and we control them or deflect them. But by the same token, look, we got to be aware of these impulses, because the more aware we are of them, the better we're able to resist them, especially when they're destructive. So to a certain extent, we gotta face who we really are, and what the potential we have to do certain things like violence, in order to form a better world. And so that's one of the caveats. But you know what? The thing is, no matter how you look at it, the God of Abraham, or the Abrahamic faith in general, are incredibly violent. At least is the way they're described in Scripture. There's kind of no getting around that.
Yes. I don't know. How about this? I don't know, though, because how many apologists have talked to you and told you that that's incorrect? And they'll talk about and they make excuses, for the God. And I think one of the best part of the books that I really liked a lot is you actually went into the biblical scripture, and you actually kind of talked about, if you look at it, these rules, these laws that were laid down weren't just meant as a morality code. They were meant to keep your in-group together, which if you look at it on an evolutionary basis, right? I mean, logically, how else can you become the dominant group and survive? And that's crazy. Like, I never thought about that. I'll put it to you this. I never once thought about that in arguing with a Christian, saying, hey, stop a minute. Let's go back to the evolutionary side of things here and look at why God would allow for the raping of conquered tribes women. Why would he do that? And why would he want unsullied women, right? I mean, it makes so much more sense when you put it in the context of what you talked about in your book.
Yeah, and so I think just for our listeners here, I think a summary of what this all means is probably important. And
yes,
one of the biggest, the main premise is that the God of the world's religions are unlike us on several key dimensions. So we mortals, for example, have an expiration date. We don't live forever. Gods live forever, according to scriptures across the world's religions. The Abrahamic God, for example, he spoke the universe into being. We don't have that kind of power. Right? Gods are supposed to know everything. So, despite what your brother-in-law may think about what he knows, nobody knows everything, we don't know everything. So basically all the omnis, omnipresent, omnipotent, omniscient, along with being everlasting and immaterial, so despite being so unlike us, this God is immensely interested in some very pedestrian kinds of things like territory and sexual control and acts of deference and dominance. I mean, just territory, for example. The central narrative of Genesis is a story of defending territory. We have a dominant male God defending his resource-rich territory in the Garden of Eden, and a lesser male emerges, Adam, defies the rule of the dominant male by taking the fruit, and so many different explanations are given for this forbidden fruit, like sex, like knowledge, like actual food. But for humans, dominant individuals like to claim access and control out of all of those. So he kicks him out of his territory. And why would a God with unlimited power care about territory or the resources within it? So men have taken that image of God and used it for their own pursuits. The conquistadors that I told you I like to study. They came to this hemisphere And one of the first things they did is they started smashing the temples, smashing the idols of the people who lived in this hemisphere. And on them, they built cathedrals, like literally on the ruins of some of these ancient temples, all to provide the conquered peoples a clear sign of the new God's male dominance. In a way, I mean, we've done it any number of ways, but that is intuitive to the primate brain, you know. And then you have the Taliban smashing these World Heritage sites because, you know, they're markers of rival, you know, they're territorial markers from rival gods. And they say, you know, Allah is pleased by this. Well, look, gods don't care. I mean, there's no God in the world that ever cared about territory. Men care about these things because we need territory to enact our evolutionary drives, to acquire resources that we need because we're mortal. And, you know, men, like other species, to get back to your kind of a long way of addressing your point, is we sometimes use violence, or have used violence, continue to use violence, to acquire those resources that we need. So, boy, the God of Abraham is just, I think somewhere it says, you know, the Lord is a man of war. So it's unequivocal there.
Yeah, that's not only a crappy 80s band, but it was in the Bible. You know, and when you think about it too, look at how they painted the Exodus, right? I mean, think about it, you know, and again, I'm not going to make a claim either which way at this current time, but we were at a convention a couple weeks ago, and they actually had it at a secular humanist Jewish temple, right? And there's a rabbi there, and he's an atheist, flat out atheist, nicest guy in the world though. And I was talking to him a little bit, and I'm hoping he's going to join me on the show here next month. And we were kind of talking about the Exodus and like, what do you feel about that? Is that real? Is it not real? How historical is this? You know, I mean, you and I both agree, yeah, there was no God that came down and murdered the firstborns. But did the Egyptians enslave them? Was that a thing? And if you think about it, and I guess maybe if you take your book and look at it in context, right? You know, you have all these, you know, Jewish people came and conquered. Well, what better way to make it look like they didn't actually lose, but to rewrite history when they could, to make it look like people made them servants, you know, people were doing it. And what better way to have their male God come on and kill the firstborns, ironically, firstborns of all the Egyptian families. How ironic is that?
Sure, it's very, very primal, you know, their ally, you know, their male ally. First of all, why does he have a sex? Does he have reproductive organs? What would he use them for if he lives forever? Why is he male? You know, because it's intuitive to the primate brain. In fact, you know, one of the things I talk about is infanticide. Oftentimes across animal species and across a number of primate species, when males acquire dominant status, a lot of times what they do is they commit infanticide. All the males living in this community, all the offspring rather, they kill them, and that sends the females into estrus more quickly. But it also rids the population with genes that would be rivals to his children. So it's dark, it's disturbing, but it serves an evolutionary purpose. And we can see how the tendency to commit infanticide would be selected for. Those who had a tendency for it would send more genes into the gene pool. Well, that what you just mentioned is just one of many examples, many examples of infanticide, either committed by God or ordered by God. You know. In the Old Testament. And in fact, Steve Wells, he wrote a book just adding up all the killings that God did in the Bible.
Yeah.
and you know, he made estimates on the probable sizes in towns and villages of that God is purported to have wiped out entirely. And 24 million was his estimate. But the Bible, he claims, is is directly described as killing 2 million, 2.5 million. And that's just like directly how many people he's kind of reported to have killed. I think Satan was like 60, something like that.
Yeah, he was under 100 or something like that. It was under 100 people that Satan had any hand in killing, and that was even a stretch, if I remember right, in how he verbalized that.
Right. I mean, but yeah, when you tell people about when you tell believers about that, I mean, I think what motivated reasoning kicks in, and that's really an important concept to know about, whether it has to do with how we look at our own religion or our own social group or our own political party. Motivated reasoning is a way to mitigate anxiety by just deflecting information, by distorting reality. And a lot of us are prone to doing that. It's really a destructive tendency, I think, and it has some really negative implications for humanity. So the worst impulses get they just get rationalized away. The worst behaviors, because of biases like that. So so yes, you're right. People do explain these away,
and they do, and it's amazing, and you can actually still see it throughout society. I mean, think about, look even at the Me Too movement. There's been a lot of men that are just dismissing this, and they're like, well, now we got to wait until it goes through this whole court of law, and we're not going to believe people until absolutely everything happens. And you're like, well, let's look at the statistics and say, how often are women lying about being raped and molested and sexually harassed? How often does that show to be true? And if you look at it again, and I guess we're kind of diverting from the book a little bit, but if you take the principles in your book though, and you actually apply it to how men are making all these denials, and again, especially if it's somebody that's a figurehead, and we won't mention that individual right now, but it's somebody that's a figurehead that you don't want to let go of. What are they doing? The same thing religion did. And then if you get rid of it and say, hey, it's not really a religion thing, right? It's just an evolutionary trait that should have been weeded out, or hopefully will be weeded out in the next, 1,000 years, hopefully. Well, hopefully sooner, but you never know.
Well, that's a big question, and in many respects, we've slowed down our own evolution because of technology. So one of the things that drives natural selection is differential survival. So those with a trait that's not incredibly conducive to surviving, they reproduce less often. So and they survive less often. Well, with all our technology, we've slowed that down tremendously. So we're stuck with these really ancient Stone Age brains trying to operate in a modern day environment. But you're right. I mean, we do that a lot with figureheads because of what figureheads meant to us in our evolutionary past. I mean, so I should mention that I'm working on another book project. I'm almost done with this manuscript, and one of the things I write about is that size, just like it matters in our gods, it matters in presidential elections. So some researchers looked at, I forget how many past presidential elections. I think it was covering like 100 years or so, and almost always the taller presidential candidate won.
I did not know that.
Why is that? We don't need big, physically formidable men to represent us, because who of our presidents is ever going to represent us in an actual fight? Well, in the days of our ancestors, that was more of reality. We wanted to draw closer to protective males. We needed allies who were powerful, And so, to get back to what you were saying, when it concerns a figurehead, especially if it's a male protector type, or supposedly a protector type, all kinds of motivated reasoning takes place outside the secular environment. I mean, outside the religious environment, in the secular environment. Like, I'm thinking of the evangelical ladies supporting Donald Trump, even though all the stuff he's done to violate their most cherished values.
Yeah, and it's Yeah, well, and it's kind of funny because you talk about, and we could talk about this a little bit, I guess. We're both a science and political show, so when you kind of look at it, I don't know what outside of Donald Trump commanding people to listen to him. If you want to take it on an evolutionary thing, what does he have? I mean, he's a little bit bigger of a guy. He is white, he's part of a main demographic. But the bigger question is, what's so attractive? And maybe it's because I've moved past certain portions of it and I'm not able to identify with that anymore, but I don't understand what the attraction there is to that individual. Now, again, we could go, let me say one more thing. We could go back to think about who he was dominating over, right? I mean, it was a woman that he spread a lot of nasty things about. And, he did a lot of tactics that could be looked at in an evolutionary light and kind of seen why people bought into some of that. He was also a lot taller than her, in fairness. And that's actually kind of a reference back in your book. But outside of that, what does Donald Trump have evolutionarily that draws that many people?
It's not rational, right? I mean, nobody can say, hey, this is rational. And that's the thing. Often our deepest evolutionary drives are not based on reason. They're based on very primitive sensors of the brain that produce raw emotion. And they're usually outside of conscious awareness. So, I think a lot of it is evolutionary because, I write about this in my Psychology Today blog about why Donald Trump, because most of the world is like, what are you guys thinking? Most of the world is torn by his candidacy, his win, and just him as a person, but look at some of the things that he promised. He promised protection from Mexican rapists, there's an ancient history of the rival tribe barreling in and raping the in-group's women, as we talked about in the Bible. Mm-hmm. He vowed to build a wall to keep these out, to literally define the territorial boundary and make them pay for it, to secure resources for us, to keep resources for us. It's all very primitive. And the thing is about political conservatives, there's a pretty significant literature on how those who are politically conservative, especially on the extreme right end, tend to be more fearful. They tend to have more fearful reactions to a variety of different kinds of stimuli, and even a bigger amygdala. That's a part of the brain that's responsible for producing fear. So if you have a predisposition to be fearful, which may have served us in our evolutionary past when things were really uncertain, right? And if we have a predisposition to be drawn towards dominant males when we're afraid, well, this makes perfect sense. When somebody starts positing a threat out there, it's going to draw in those people. And reason is going to go out the window. And that's the thing. And this is why, understanding evolutionary science is so important. Even though it may be uncomfortable, how else can we be rational if we don't understand why we're irrational?
Yeah.
We don't understand our triggers.
Yeah. And if you think about it, the more you understand about it and the more that you can accept that this is the way it is, the sooner you can change. And you can actually then go out to try and make a positive change inside of your own brain, hopefully inside of your community as well. So going back to your book a little bit, throughout the book, you were talking about different types of the religious groups, and you're in groups and these different smaller sects of religion, right? And then it kind of grows. We now see two, and I guess we'll just say one to begin with, predominant religion that's all of a sudden kind of taken over the world. And maybe it's because we live in America, but I would wager that Christianity is probably one of the most polarizing popular religions ever. And where did that stem from? From Judaism, right? And if you think about it, though, a lot of the origins of that, and not all of it is specific, but a lot of those origins talk about, how these nomad groups came about. This one just happened to be the one that, took off and was better suited evolutionarily to survive. So one of the arguments I always get when I have to argue with Christians, if I choose to, is they like to say, well, if you look at the Bible and everything in it, it's so much more moral than anything at the time. I don't 100% agree with that, really, because there is a lot of other minor ones. To me, it almost feels like they rewrote it and decided that this was the morals of the time. Therefore, none of these other religions have morals.
Yeah, so it's would be an enormous stretch to read the Bible for any kind of historical accuracy, because it's been written across many centuries and rewritten so many times for political reasons. But one thing I often ask people is when we start talking about this topic is like, well, what is morality? Can we operationally define it? It's a hard thing to actually define, but I think it certainly would benefit us to really have these kinds of discussion, because what it's meant for a huge part of our history is how you treat the in-group, like you said. Nothing to do with the out-group. So, I wasted no opportunity to point out something about the Judeo-Christian faith. And you see this mentality across almost every group in the whole world, is that there's a moral code for members of your in-group that drops off when you start to get around the fringe of your group. Like, it starts to drop off. The rules don't apply to the outsiders. And one of the most telling examples of this that comes out of the Bible is when Moses comes down from the mountain bearing the freshly inscribed stone tablet saying, "Thou shalt not kill." Well, again, I've said this many times, one of the first things he did is says, okay, now slaughter all these people because they're worshiping the wrong religion. Slaughter them, kill them all. So it really didn't mean that. It just meant don't kill in-group members.
Yeah.
Many people are fair game. You can kill them, just don't kill your own kind. It was a rule designed to help people survive a time where there were just these incredibly vicious conflicts between rivaling tribes. I mean, the Fertile Crescent during the biblical era was a terrible time to live.
Yeah. Especially if you were a woman, right?
Especially if you were a woman, especially if you belonged to a group that wasn't large and powerful, because you just get hacked to pieces by anybody who could. That was the law then. If you could do it, you did it. And so, you in such an environment, you have to establish rules for the in-group so that you can survive the out-group, so to speak.
So as we talk through Judaism and Christianity and all of that, right? We talk about the fear and the violence that came from an evolutionary construct, right? And I don't want to call it a construct in the fact that it's some preordained thing. So it's a scientific fact that this is where we came from, right? So if we want to talk about the fear and the violence, right, and how horrible it is, did that actually help us, though, evolutionarily become, more intelligent based on the fact that we were able to control different factors within our society as we developed? So think of it this way, if you're able to control, if let's say your group's the best at whatever it's doing, you're conquering all these people, you're rewriting history to your needs. Does it mean that because these fear things allowed us to evolve faster, or do you feel that maybe this is kind of somewhat of a hindrance by having one larger group with one group mind essentially take over a portion of the world?
So are you asking whether or not fear made us evolve to be more intelligent?
Yes. We obviously they didn't understand the concept other than they knew what the reaction they were going to get, right? So they knew the reaction they were going to get through instilling fear. They just don't understand any of the other consequences or what it does to other people. But was it evolutionarily beneficial to us, and did it help accelerate us through? For example, we evolved and are evolving awareness faster than other species are. Maybe that's a better way to clarify that.
Well, if I'm interpreting what you're saying correctly, I mean, I think that there's such a concept as the evolutionary mismatch, and that is that what sometimes we have adaptations for our environment that when the environment changes, they no longer serve us. So if you're living in an incredibly hostile environment, it benefits us to be fearful of the outside group. And, research on hunter-gatherers, at least one researcher found that a third of all males within hunter-gatherer groups will be killed by other males. A third. That is a giant swath of a population. A little less for women, because women were often taken as sexual spoils, but it was still high.
Yeah.
So imagine living in a place where, you risk being speared to death every single day from outsiders. It benefits you to turn into your group and to have kind of a insular way of thinking, favor your group, be biased towards your group, be biased towards the outsider. But we don't live in these tribes anymore. We're forming these globalistic unions. Our economies are connecting. Our cultures are connecting. Our technology is connecting. The biggest question is, does that serve us anymore? And I don't think it does. I think it's a hindrance, So, how much threat of outsiders made us more intelligent? Well, yeah, maybe it did. I think a lot of our intelligence and a lot of even our brain size was pushed by trying to understand other minds, and that's one of the things that led to projecting minds into the ether, so to speak. But I think the broader point that I see there is that it doesn't serve us anymore to be so tribalistic, because we're gratuitously tribalistic. Even, under a same flag, we'll start to form in groups and we'll start to demonize our own, fellow citizens because they don't belong to that group. We're immensely tribalistic. We strain against anything larger than the size of a tribe. We've gotten better at it, and there's a lot of research suggesting we've become more peaceable as a species since our days as hunter-gatherers. But it's by overcoming those impulses, not by ignoring them. That's why I always come back to that. Like, yeah, it might be hard to look at this, but you know what? We got to look at it.
Oh yeah. So I guess, if you think that we've evolved past the need for the fear tactics, right, and the violence tactics, which is probably good, it's probably good for all of us at this point. We don't need a bunch of people running around killing each other all the time. Do you feel if we went back in time, let's say even, 4,000 years ago, and kind of looked at an evolutionary scale, was religion kind of that next step in a way to help project our evolutionary upbringing, or our evolutionary, I guess not upbringing, but bringing us towards a more intelligent species? Was it, I don't want to say necessary or preordained, right? But, to a point, us being able to project our image as a god and use it in a fear-based tactic when we were in hunter-gatherer tribes, was that a way for us to help evolve faster? Or maybe not, I guess, again, I'm saying the wrong word, maybe not faster, but help us evolve differently than other species have?
Well, that's a great question, and so there are a couple things that I want to respond to. One is, did we evolve past the need for violence? I don't think entirely. There are still legitimate threats from outsiders. Could we do without it? Sure. Like one of the things that drove violence between human groups is scarcity. And there's a lot of archaeological evidence showing that, a lot of all kinds of evidence showing that. Scarcity drove competition. But when we were hunter-gatherers, we were living far more at the mercy of nature. Now, nature is at our mercy. We could feed the world. We could eradicate hunger from the human experience, or starvation anyway. So we don't need that as much anymore. So I don't can we dispense with the military altogether? No, because we're not there yet. But does it need to be at the forefront? Do we need to have the most aggressive, domineering males at the spearhead of our government or our politics? I don't think so. Personally, usually the healthiest societies have moved beyond that and kind of put that impulse on the back burner, so to speak. But there are some arguments about whether religion was an adaptation or whether it was just kind of like a fluke. I'm more in the school of it's probably an adaptation, and most people think, well, it really helps cement tribal unity, and the way it cemented tribal unity is looking into the clouds and seeing a headman there who decides on where we go and leads us into battle and gives us confidence fighting the rival group and comes up with all these rules that we're going to follow. And uses fear to get us to abide by these rules. So it may have helped us form better unions with one another, or at least more effective ones. But again, do we need that? Do we need Stone Age or Bronze Age mentalities running things in the age of technology?
Probably not. But when you look at that, and when you talk to these things, it's just, again, it goes back to the interesting side of things, right? The interesting side of it says, as much as we will despise religion and all the horrible things it's done, if we actually can acknowledge how it's enhanced our evolutionary process, it's a little bit more digestible for me, at least as an individual, to say, okay, hey, how can we learn from our past mistakes? Or as religion would call it, how do you learn from your past sins? Yeah. So how about empathy? So religion touts empathy. You could see throughout the Bible a change. When Jesus come, do you think that was something that was a new in-group tribe that kind of started within another tribe that rose to power? Or do you feel, evolutionarily wise, that's just something that naturally started to happen and people just started to shun the old ways as a collective group versus a smaller in-group taking rise?
Well, that's a great question. And I think how Christianity evolved from the Roman era, I think a lot of people have written about that. I think there are empathic figures in many religions. It's not just the image of Jesus Christ, but I think compared to the God of Abraham, much more compassionate figure. And I often argue that, look, if Christ were alive today, he would definitely be liberal, not conservative, because of all the compassion. I mean, would he really want harsh economic policies that only favor the rich, for example? No, he was empathic to those suffering, those lower on the hierarchy. He trashed the marketplace in Jerusalem. He scorned the money, the money lenders and stuff like that. So, yeah, so who knows how that? I mean, I don't know that I can give a really detailed. Go into a really detailed foray on how Christianity evolved. Other people have, but it's certainly, I think, Jesus Christ is certainly a more compassionate figure than the God of Abraham, who killed 2.5 million people, supposedly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Although, I just got to point out, no God's killed anybody. There's no God that's ever killed anybody. Men.
Yeah, men kill. It's the whole point of your book, Alpha God, right? It's the man God.
Men kill people, and it's not women. Usually it's men. Are there women who are killers? Yes. Is killing far disproportionately a male enterprise? You bet. I mean, there's mountains of scientific evidence showing that. So we got to understand where it comes from. It comes from these really old survivalist kinds of adaptations.
one of the chapters in your books, in your book, because you have 2 books now coming out. We have one coming out, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. One of your chapters kind of talks about the hat thing, right? You know, and I don't want to make it this big thing, but I did find it kind of interesting to talk about the hats, right? You know, it's a dominance thing. It's like, and then you kind of talked about what do females desire, right? What do females desire inside of, you know, men? So if you're looking to procreate, you're looking for that safe environment, the more dominant environment, the one that's going to survive the longest. And you know, you get into 100 million other offshoots of that. But I have a weird question that I kind of wanted to tie to that. And then, so I want you to talk a little bit about the hat analogy that you give. And then I want to tie this into, think about it this way. There's a lot of people that leave religion recently. For example, I'm one of them. I've been out of religion, officially out for 5 years. And I've probably been out for a good 10 to 15 years out of hardcore religion. And I won't tell you the whole backstory because it's just a long backstory. And if you listen to the show, you'll hear it at some point. But there's a lot of people that do go back after they apostatize from religion. They go back to religion. And I don't know whether it's a man or a woman thing. I don't know if there's a difference. But think about it this way. So you talk about the hats and how this stabilizes and how religion does these different things to provide this base level evolutionary security, right? What about going back? Is there a way to relate some of that? Is there a reason some people want to go back because they're going back to a safer evolutionary, you know, confine that they're used to or that feels more natural? I don't know.
I think you hit it on the head. It feels more natural. I mean, one of the things that I think people fear so much about leaving their religion is like, look, am I committing social suicide here? Am I leaving my tribe? Am I leaving my clan? That just provides, it just pings on so many of these evolutionary adaptations that are designed to make the brain light up. In the presence of a big alpha male who provides protection against the rival clan, you know, of surrounded by my tribesmates, you know. I mean, religion is nothing if not a tribalistic experience. You know, you do all these rituals together, you say them together at the same time, you become one. There's a sense of unity that's very powerful. And I think sometimes when people leave religion, they miss that. They miss that tremendously. And, you know, for that, I think the secular community could, you know, maybe do a better job of providing, you know, a place for people to land, but to some extent, the odds are stacked against the secular movement because, you know, the abstractions of the universe and physics and evolution, you know, studying that stuff is fascinating, but what's more easily digestible to the primate brain? There's an alpha male out there who wants you part under his wing, you know, and there's a tribe waiting to embrace you under him. Yeah, that's emotionally intuitive, you know. But I think a huge amount of it has to do with leaving the tribe. It's scary.
Yeah. So how about the hats? We got to talk a little bit about the hats. We can't let the show go. Talk about the hats.
Talk about the hats. There are a lot of adaptations that animals have to make their heads look bigger. And it's usually used as a threat display. A lion's big mane. Some lizards have these flaps that flare out like umbrellas on the sides of their heads to make their heads look bigger, to be threatening. It's concentrated in males. Primate species have a ton of these. Look at that adult male orangutan. That he has these giant fatty face pads on the side of his face and a long orange beard. Men have beards and men grow beards. And you know, it's no surprise that we see these displays that we find in the animal kingdom so prominent among men because we use it to intimidate other men and to show dominance. I write about how there were these rivaling groups of Amish men that attacked each other. And what do? They sheared off each other's beards. That was an act of domination, right? But we have the ability to, you know, to use our technology to exaggerate head size by putting on these large head displays, basically big hats, right? And they're usually meant to convey dominance. You see people on the hierarchy in militaries, and the generals have these big hats where the subordinates have small hats. The same thing on the religious hierarchy, big hats. When you want to show deference in church, the men have to take their hats off to show deference to God. Women aren't required to do that because it's based on male mate competition. The Pope wears this giant hat sparkling with jewels, which has implications too for power, right, and wealth. And when he's crowned with the papal tiara, it's called, these words are said, and I can't remember them exactly, but it's something like, "No, you are the ruler of kings. You're all powerful." Like that's what this hat means. Receive it. Yeah. So, in Revelations, Jesus Christ comes down and submits all the kings of the earth, and he takes their crowns. Yeah. He goes and he's wearing a big stack of their crowns. I mean, it's a dominance gesture.
It reminds me of that book I read as a kid called "Caps for Sale." As soon as you started talking about it in the book, I'm sitting here going, "Shit, what's the name of that? What's the name of that book? Hold on, I got to go find it." And I went and found it, and I was like, "It's this book for." And I don't know why I remember that book so much. Maybe because it's a dominance thing, right? Maybe I identify that way with that book. Even though he gave away his caps, he gave them away. I mean, in the essence, he gave them away. It was like the essence of, how do I get rid of all my caps? But as soon as you were talking about the hats in the book, I had to go find that book, and then I had to go read it to my kids to be like, "Hey, remember this? I had this book when I was a kid," and they're like, "We're not impressed, Dad. We don't care about this book. This is a stupid book." But that's kind of what when you take and you talk about the dominance thing, it made sense, right? And if you think about inside of an in-group, I wear a Red Wings hat. I'm from Michigan. I like hockey. My team's the Red Wings. They're not any better than the Chicago Black. Well, okay, they are better than the Chicago Blackhawks. But, logically speaking, they're not. Same with the Lions. I wear a Lions hat. Now, I could tell you that they've never won a Super Bowl, ever. But I still wear the hat. Because if you walk around Michigan, you see people with Lions hats on. Everybody's like, hey, it's okay, man. We're going to win this year. And it's a camaraderie thing that you just don't ever think about. Never thought about that until you mentioned, why do you wear the hats? Oh, yeah. Well, now I don't want to wear my Lions hat anymore.
Well, listen, it's also concentrated among fighting men. I mean, look at George Washington's hat. What this giant hat. Look at Native Americans' buffalo headdress or a full eagle headdress. Those are worn into battle. Look at the Queen's Guard. You know what those guys look like? It's this giant hat made out of bear skin. So go figure. How primal is that? It's not meant to be subtle. It's meant to show dominance. And you bring up an interesting point because, look, religion is just one way that these tribalistic impulses get enacted. It's just one way. But human beings, more so men, will form rivaling tribes in a number of ways. Sometimes you wear the rival team's cap into their territory, and you get a butt whooping. You're fighting literally. And look how sports teams fight one another in the stands, especially soccer. Those guys are crazy.
Oh yeah.
So it could be political parties, it could be sports teams, it could be motorcycle gangs, it could be what city block are you from?
Yeah.
It could be anything. Religion is just one means of expressing these impulses. But the thing about religion is that scrutinizing it is often forbidden. It's considered heresy or blasphemy. And that is what makes it dangerous. Because then, all the injustices, all the traumas that happen, and as a result of religion, they're not brought into the light of scrutiny.
Mm-hmm.
That's what makes it dangerous.
So before the show, you and I were talking a little bit, and you had mentioned that you have a new book coming out. And I didn't even know you were writing another book, I guess. So this is kind of good. What's your new book about? And when is it even going to be released? Or when is your scheduled release date?
Not sure. I'm just finishing up the manuscript, and then, there's a long process that happens after that. Hopefully soon. But the idea is that the main thrust of the book is an attempt to explain why we have political parties. where do they come from? The left and right is a consistent way to capture political views across the world, and there are certain qualities among the left and right that have some really interesting evolutionary implications. People on the left tend to be more empathic, more verbal, more open to other people, more into sharing, and in a lot of ways that represents a feminine psychology. People on the right tend to be more hawkish, they tend to be more territorial, they tend to be more in-group, they tend to be more into hierarchies. And we know where that comes from.
Yeah.
How did we arrive at these political orientations? What implications do they have for public policy? What implications do they have for foreign policy? That's the idea. And largely to explain what has happened to America since the election of 45. I mean, that was the impetus. That's what drove that's what made me pull the trigger on the book. But it isn't the only time, and it's not the only country where that has become divided along partisan lines. So
I have an odd question related to that, I guess. And maybe we can even relate this back to your current book. So I grew up extremely conservative. My co-host and I gave a talk at a convention a couple weeks ago, and essentially, we talked about our upbringings a little bit. And one of my upbringings was I grew up listening to Rush Limbaugh. Like, my dad is a diehard Fox News person, always has been. I've listened to more conservative talk radio than you can imagine. And of course, I grew up extremely conservative Baptist. I was in a private school that was religious. We did home devotions, all sorts of stuff. When I turned 18 is when I first started to kind of, push away from the church and kind of move away from some of that. But politically, I moved faster politically than I did religiously, I guess I would say. I became a pseudo-Christian, and then I became very spiritual. And then, but politically, I kind of all of a sudden went from wanting to vote Republican to saying, why would I ever vote for this? And just completely went like off in left field. And like my social views now, I'm a cross between like a social Democrat and a social anarchist. I'm that far left. So, and I've not gone back. So in the new book, do you talk anything about that? Is there any discussion psychologically? I mean, is there a way that we can part from our old ways specifically, no longer identify with that type of in-group?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, again, coming back to being aware of that fallacy and acknowledging that concern that, look, if we admit we have a genetic predisposition, something, are we doomed to enact that, whatever it is? No, we're not. I mean, as you can talk all day about ways that we refuse the adaptations that were dealt us, right? I mean, we're both wearing glasses, for example.
That's true.
Sunscreen. We both drive cars. These were problems in genes coding for eyesight and skin pigmentation and speed that we're overcoming. That we're changing if we choose to. So, there's a scientific explanation for what I'm saying, right? And twin studies, for example, show that 30 to 60% of the variance in our political preferences is due to genetic factors. So that doesn't mean that we're genetically programmed political automatons. In fact, it would suggest that at least environment contributes to 40% of the variance in how we behave politically. So there's almost always the ability to choose things like that. I mean, really what's happening too is that, the political parties sit atop these underlying personality factors that make us more likely to pursue a particular political party. But, again, the idea is that, look, the more we understand about these things, the more we can make rational choices. rational choices and not be moved purely by emotion, whichever path we choose to go. Making rational choices, I would argue, is the better way to go.
Well, cool. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Hector Garcia, author of Alpha God, The Psychology of Religious Violence and Oppression. Thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Well, listen, thank you so much for having me. It's been a great conversation. I appreciate it.
Yep. Thank you so much for joining us. All the links will be in the description of the show. You'll be able to purchase his book. I think you have it on Amazon at least. I know you have it on Amazon for Kindle and through paperback. It's a wonderful read, and it'll definitely enlighten you. Thank you again so much for joining us.
Thank you.
You've been listening to a presentation of Cellar Door Skeptics. Check us out on Spreaker, cellardoorskeptics.com.